You clicked on this video because you want to see if the Sony ZV E10 is capable of being cinematic. So let's just get right to it and check out this footage here. When we talk about the word cinematic, it seems like it's become this word that means a lot of different things. It could mean that there's bokeh, where the background is blurred out, the foreground is in focus. It could mean slow motion with music over it. It could just be transitions. It could be a number of things. So what truly is cinematic and what does it mean? Well, in a nutshell, basically cinematic just means film or movies that looks like a movie or what's in the cinema. So then you ask yourself, well, there's different types of movies. You have comedies, dramas, actions, thrillers, mysteries. So how do we define that? Well, what we have to look at is what is the common thread through all of these different movie genres. And that is, it's controlled, it's planned, it's calculated, it's scripted, it's blocked, it's rehearsed, and finally, it's shot. So all those things go into being cinematic before we can actually call it cinematic. So now the question is the Sony ZV E10 capable of being cinematic when we look at it that way? Absolutely, it is. It definitely is. Technology has come a very, very long way. If you guys haven't noticed, things like cell phones now are being classified as digital cinemas or digital devices that are able to shoot cinema quality video. Take, for instance, the iPhone 13 that just came out. They had DPs, directors, all these different people using this phone to shoot this film that we were able to see. And you ask yourself, well, is the ZV-10 capable of it? Yes, because of all of these things that we look at, it's not just the camera itself. It's the planning, it's the blocking, it's the story. All of this goes into being cinematic. So the question becomes, how do we get cinematics out of the Sony ZV E10 or for any camera for that matter? Well, that is a great question, and I'm glad you asked. I'm not going to be able to break that down in one video. This is going to have to be a series of videos because just like we said, there are many different things that lead to something being cinematic, from the movement to the lighting to the music, blocking, the framing. All of these things go into something being cinematic. So I just want to give a really quick breakdown of how to get a cinematic look out of the Sony ZV E10. The Sony ZV E10 is not the best camera in the world. It's not even the highest quality in the world. There are many cameras that have better bit rate, that have better dynamic range, that have bigger sensors, that can work better in low light, that are stable. There's a lot of things that other cameras have over the Sony ZV E10, but that doesn't mean that we can't get a cinematic look out of it, as you just saw. One of the first areas when it comes to cinematics is lighting. If you don't get your light right, it's not going to look right. And a lot of people overlook this. They go to picture profiles first, they go to LUTs, they go to lenses, they go to all of these things. But really, the light is the thing that's going to dictate how everything is going to look. The shaping of the light, the placement of where the light is going to be. Is it going to come from the side? Is it going to be at a 45-degree angle? Are you going to have grids and modifiers and bounces and all these different things to get the light and to control the light the way you want it. If you don't control your light, you can kiss cinematics goodbye. This is one of the #1 things that I see. Now, I am by no means a professional cinematographer, but I have seen and I have worked with light enough to know that if you don't control it, you will not get the look that you're looking for. So you ask your question, well, how do I control the light? Well, again, I'm glad you asked. If you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, this is something you need to get familiar with. This is your ISO, your shutter speed, and aperture. All of these things work together to give you light, to cut out light, and manipulate the light. Now, they all have different functions and they do more than one thing. I'm not going to get deep into that today, but I want to tell you about some of the tools that you have built inside of the Sony ZV E10 to help you control your exposure. The first one is your histogram. Now, the histogram is a graphical representation of what you're looking at as far as the light goes, your exposure. To the right is going to be your highlights. In the middle is going to be your midtones, and the left side is going to be your shadows or the dark places. Now, a rule of thumb is you want to keep all of the peaks and things like that within this square. Now, that is just a start. Again, this is not a deep lesson on histograms and things like that, but I will tell you that this is just the start. If you're peaking on one side to where all of the lines are smashed to the right, then more than likely you're overexposed. And if everything is smashed to the left, then likely you're underexposed. Now, the thing with this tool is you have to take it with a grain of salt because it is taking a measurement of your whole picture. And some parts you may want to be brighter than others, and some parts you maybe want darker than others. So you have to take that with a grain of salt, but you have to get to know your histogram and how it works and what it is. The second thing is your exposure meter. Now, this thing kind of works the same way. Now, you can set different metering points and things like that. There's evaluative, there's different types of metering. But in general, what you want to do is try and keep your exposure so that it's in the middle. So it's at 0. If it's to the right, then it's going to be a little bit overexposed. If it's to the left, and it'll have a minus sign there, it'll be underexposed. So that's one of the other keys to controlling your light. Now, I would recommend an external monitor, something that has false color. False color is basically a representation of the exposure on each part of your picture. For instance, if you're looking at my face here and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't overexposed or underexposed, I'll turn false color on, and false color would actually show me if my face is gray, if it's red, if it's yellow. And these different colors will indicate the different exposure levels or the IRE. So again, we don't want to get too technical here, but that is another tool. So using all of these vector scopes and all these different things to look at colors and exposure is going to be one of the things that's going to help you. Now, the really important thing about the ZV E10 is knowing that it has limitations. And one of those limitations is that it's 8-bit. Again, I don't want to go too deep, but what I will say is this: when you have 8-bit, you have less information that is being stored from your video. So what does that mean? So that means that transitions from dark to light, you may see steps like actual bands. You'll see those, and you'll see those when you're pushing your camera beyond what it's able to do. So this is another reason why it's very important to shape and control your light, because if you don't shape and control your light, it's going to show up and the weaknesses of the camera are going to be amplified. Now, if you shot in RAW, if you had the ability to shoot RAW video, it would be a different story. We're not even going to get into the 422, the 420, that sort of thing. But just know that there's halving of pixels, and there's a lot more when it comes to color and that sort of thing that we won't get into. The first is your aperture. The aperture is the opening of the lens that lets light in. Now, depending on if it's open wide or if it's stopped down, that's going to determine how much light is going to come in, and it's also going to determine your depth of field. The wider your aperture is, the more light is going to come in, and the more shallower your depth of field is going to be, which means that objects in the foreground will be in focus while objects in the background will be out of focus. So that is your aperture. Second is your ISO. Now your ISO is again the sensor that picks up light in your camera, which changes that into digital information and stores it on your memory card. The ISO is basically the sensitivity of that sensor to light. So the more sensitive the sensor is to light, the more light it's going to gather. But also the higher you turn the sensitivity up, or the gain on the sensor, is going to create noise. Noise is just random fluctuation in the brightness of individual pixels. So in a nutshell, just know that you don't want that. You don't want noise in your footage because that looks like grain. Now, some people may want that, but most people don't want noise. So in order to avoid noise, you don't want to shoot in really low light, or you don't want to shoot in low light with your sensor turned way up to where it's trying to amplify what isn't there. And that's when you start to get grain. Now, the last one here is your shutter speed. Again, your shutter speed is very crucial when it comes to light. The faster your shutter speed is, the less light you're going to get. The slower your shutter speed, the more light you're going to get. And remember, most of these, or all of these, affect more than one thing. They affect light, but then they affect something else. So with shutter speed, you're also affecting your motion. So if typically you want to keep the 180-degree shutter rule, which is if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then you want your shutter speed to be double that, which would be 48. Now, most of these cameras don't shoot in 48, so the closest to that is 50. So we shoot 1/50 for our shutter speed. Now, if you're out on a sunny day and you're trying to shoot at that, you may find that there's too much light coming into the lens, and you may have to adjust your aperture. Well, what if you still want a shallow depth of field? How do you do that? The key is a variable ND filter, or an ND filter, which just means neutral density filter, which means that cuts down on the light that's coming in. So if you cut down on the light that's coming in, then that'll allow you to use a shutter speed of 1/50 and shoot at 24 frames per second, and an aperture of 1.4 if you're trying to keep the shallow depth of field, or whatever your lens is capable of. So again, I don't want to get too technical on this video, but to answer the question, can the Sony ZV E10 shoot cinematic video? Yes, it can, but you have to get down into the nitty-gritty of things, and you have to understand how all of these different things work together to get what you're wanting out of the Sony ZV E10. But it is capable. I will say that it's definitely capable. So you may be asking, so, okay, that's good with all the technical stuff, but what's a good lens? What lens did you use in the video that we watched? Well, it's the Sigma 16mm 1.4. And I'm going to put that down in the description here so you can take a look at it and buy it. It's a very great lens, and it's worth every cent. So definitely check out the Sigma 16mm 1.4. Let's go ahead and wrap this up and make it clear for us. So with the Sony ZV E10, yes, it is capable of shooting cinematic shots. You have to control your light. You have to control your scene. You have to control your movements. You have to know how to edit. You have to know the limitations of the camera, and you have to have the right gear. So again, I would recommend learning the ISO, aperture, and the shutter speed triangle, or the exposure triangle. And once you learn that triangle, then you also want to get into learning the limitations of your camera, which is lighting, knowing where to place the light, how bright to turn the light up. Then you also want to get yourself a monitor that has the ability to expose using false color. This is a very important tool here. Histograms are great. Zebras are great. All these things are good, but you're going to need more tools to be able to actually see what you're getting. So if you're trying to just throw a LUT on something without understanding exposure and all of that, it's never going to look good. I guarantee you. I don't care who made the LUT. So you have to learn lighting. So like this video if this was helpful to you, and leave some comments below. If you got questions, leave those as well. But until next time, I'll holler at y'all later. I'm out. Peace.